statins only add 4 days to your life. So this is kind of a very funny claim. When you read this online, it sounds very believable. You have like other people online saying, well, yeah, you know, the benefit of statins is really not that much. You know, you could take it and it doesn't really do much and it doesn't really increase your life expectancy. And these people sound credible. Some of them are other doctors, which turns out they're mostly chiropractors, or these doctors that have been, you know, kind of way out there. You know, watch my other video on some of these doctors and quote unquote cardiologists that disagree with me. You know, it turns out most of them are just scamming you to sell some kind of like crazy books or some supplements or some nonsense. So absolutely not. Statins do not just add 4 days to your life. The study that is based off of is actually severely flawed. And the authors of the study themselves said, this study is flawed. We were thinking of not even publishing it because we know a lot of these people are going to misrepresent the study results and misuse it. But in the name of science, we decided to go ahead and publish it. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Allo. I'm a double board certified cardiologist. I am the one who actually wrote the book on cholesterol and heart disease that hopefully many future generation of physicians and cardiologists will be using as their reference or their textbooks for all things heart disease, cholesterol, and longevity. So let's tackle this a little bit. I'm gonna do this in 2 sections. Number one, kind of the general layperson explanation, and then we could dive a little bit deeper into the data and science of it, including the exact study that these people are referring to. And I think it's important to get to that study because that is like the one single study of all the studies that have ever been published on cholesterol that show longevity benefit, all-cause mortality benefit, reduction in death, heart attacks, strokes, peripheral artery disease, kidney disease, you know, all of that up against one single study that wasn't even a real study. It was a projection model and some sort of algorithm calculation type thing. So first of all, just from a medical standpoint, if you look at the studies that have been done on statin medications, and this is a huge meta-analysis, 26 studies. I'll put it up here. Look at the forest plot. Nearly every single study has shown a reduction in all-cause mortality. And don't forget, these are short studies. These are studies that have been done for like a year or two, maybe 5 at the most. And even if you were on that medicine for just a year or two, you had a reduction in all-cause mortality. For those of you who don't know what an all-cause mortality is, it is a reduction in any kind of death whatsoever. That means like stroke, heart attack, those are included, those are cardiovascular, but like we're talking other things like cancer, amputations, autoimmune disease, car accidents, whatever it might be, all of those things are included in all-cause mortality. If you want to go even broader, you technically could include like even suicide and God knows what, infections, those kind of things. Not that statins have a direct relationship or effect on, for example, infections or autoimmune disease, but maybe there's some underlying mechanism that has not yet been elucidated that would lead to, less infections. If you're stronger and your arteries are stronger and you don't have as much plaque in your arteries, maybe so. So just from a logical standpoint, we know that something that reduces your LDL cholesterol by that much definitely improves outcomes because, for example, we definitely know there's a significant reduction in cardiovascular endpoints. So if we know that for every 1 millimole reduction in LDL cholesterol, and 1 millimole in American is 38.6. So for every 38, let's say 40 milligram reduction in LDL cholesterol, let's say your LDL is 135 or 140, we drop it to 100, there's a 26% reduction in all cardiovascular endpoints, whether it's heart attacks, strokes, cardiovascular death, whatever it might be. So that is huge. For every 35, there's a reduction in, 26%. The next 35 would also be similar, and so on and so forth. And that's been shown across all the board. All of the studies, when combined into a giant, data set without excluding any studies. A lot of these people be like, well, what about that one study? Don't exclude any studies. Put them all in together. If you put them all in together, this is the data that it spits out. So that is, kind of the best kind of overall view of it. If you look at the area under the curve for some of these studies, if you put somebody on, let's say, a statin for 1 or 2 years, let's say you increase their lifespan by a few months, But what if they stay on that now and have a decreased LDL for the rest of their lives, the next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? Like, for example, the WASCOPS trial. There's a 20-year data on it now. Those kind of things. We'll dive deep into that when we get into the, more detailed data section of this video. So I think let's just dive right in. So I'm going to basically almost read you the chapter in the book, Cholesterol Truths. If you don't have Cholesterol Truths, you really should go get it. It's 516 pages. It's a hardcover. It's full color, beautiful graphics. Spent almost 2 years writing this, over 800 studies that we go over. This is a chapter on there on, do statins really only add 4 days to your lifespan? So I'm going to read it to you and put up the graphics from these studies up here as we go along. If you don't, if you're not watching this on video, I highly recommend you probably do. But this is how we can combat this, piece of misinformation that seems to be so prevalent in society. Another claim made by these anti-cholesterol medfluencers is that taking statins only adds 4 days to your lifespan. If you have gotten this far in the book, you realize that this is utter nonsense. There are even a few cardiologist medfluencers, which I've talked about in several other videos, go watch some of my other videos, selling contrarian anti-cholesterol and anti-statin books that base their entire career on this claim, which is very sad. Go watch the video that I posted saying it's titled something to the effect of, why do other cardiologists and other doctors disagree with you? There is no doubt that modern medicine has added 30 to 50 years to lifespans. If you have read other sections of this book, you will see that even in just cardiology, we have reduced death rates from cardiovascular disease 70% since 1968 and another 22% from 2013 to 2023 and another 10% in just the last 10 years. Let's start by looking at the world population levels. And I'm going to put the charts up here. The world population in the 1500s up to about 1800 was barely 1 billion people. And it slowly crept up till we finally got to 1 billion, somewhere around 1850 to 1900, right? And then it explodes up to almost 9 billion now. So I'm going to put that chart up here while we're reading through and going through this. In 1986, we had 4.9 billion people on Earth. Most of us remember that and recall thinking that was an astonishingly large number. In 2024, we have over 8 billion people on Earth and the number keeps growing. Sure, much of this growth is due to improved living conditions, less war, improved infant mortality rates, antibiotics, clean drinking water, and large-scale agriculture. But a large portion of the population explosion since the 1980s is due to modern medications and therapeutics. As an aside, the first statin hit the market in 1987. So 1987, the first statin hits the market. And from that day forward, we've not just because of statins, obviously, but due to therapeutic stent technology. The first stent was like 1989. Previous to that, we only had balloons. But since that time, we've had an explosion in improvements in cardiovascular outcomes, especially dementia, neurological disease, strokes, heart attacks, peripheral artery disease, all that kind of stuff. We finally had medications that were super easy to make, super cheap, that could absolutely really lower your cholesterol, when previously most of the medications we had could lower your cholesterol by just a smidgen. These medications could actually lower your cholesterol quite a bit. So and then there's a study, the link there to all the studies. Of course, every single part of this book, every sentence, every paragraph, every claim that I make has at least one study or multiple studies. So how do they reach the conclusion that you only add 4 days to your lifespan? It appears to be based on a study published by the British Medical Journal, Open Edition, titled "The Effect of Statins on Average Survival in Randomized Trials and Analysis of Endpoint Postponement." And this is a mathematical projection model. This is not actually like we put people on the study and then measure how long they live. This is actually a projection model. The study looked at statin studies up to the year 2009 and later added 2010 and 2011. The number of studies used in this analysis was only 11. This is very low. They included studies that tracked all-cause mortality data. These studies lasted 2 to 6 years. Further, approximately 43,000 of the patients in these studies were on the weaker statins, pravastatin, and simvastatin. They concluded that statins added 1 to 4.8 days of lifespan based on their prediction models and projections. If you have gotten this far in the book, you already know the inherent problems of this study. The authors know too, but let's go through them one by one. If you have gotten, looking at the studies that only followed people for 2 to 4 years on average, Looking at studies that only followed people 2 to 4 years on average will not give you robust data on all-cause mortality at all. Full stop. Read the section in this book on why chasing all-cause mortality in medical therapeutic studies is not helpful and absurd. And that is, I think, another video that I posted on YouTube here called Chasing All-Cause Mortality or something to that effect. Many of the studies included the weakest statins, and when the studies used atorvastatin and rosuvastatin, which are more potent statins, many times they were at much weaker doses. Sure, sometimes they had a higher dose, but that does not change the point. This reduces and diminishes effect size. They also had to be stopped early. Many of these studies, because of how profound the effect of rosuvastatin and atorvastatin were, they had to stop the study early. Like for example, the Jupiter trial, they're supposed to run it for 5 years. They stopped after like 13 months because it was unethical to leave the placebo group not on medications because you had such a huge reduction in mortality, strokes, heart attacks, and whatnot. Now back to the text. They also used data that was available up until 2009 and maybe up to 2011. Most statin studies up until that point were mostly on weaker statins for short periods of time. The first statin, lovastatin, to acquire FDA approval was on the market in 1987. It was not until 2004 that statins published their own outcome trials, simvastatin in the 4S and pravastatin in the WASCOPs. Afterwards, several synthetic statins were developed in order, fluvastatin, atorvastatin, servastatin, which was actually taken off the market, and rosuvastatin, which is Crestor, and now pitavastatin, which is called Livalo. All except servastatin have randomized control trials showing reductions in MACE. MACE stands for major adverse cardiovascular events. These are like heart attacks, strokes, death, those kind of things. Currently, all statins except Livalo are available as generics, and that will, by the time you watch this video, is probably going to be generic. It wasn't until 2001 that rosuvastatin came to market and was widely available. Because it wasn't generic until 2016, most people were not on the most potent statin or not on it for very long when the data was published. Further, taking a snapshot of 2 to 4 years and extrapolating it over a lifetime isn't accurate since we know that risk reduction is cumulative. And the absolute risk reduction improves drastically over time. See the above sections regarding the area under the curve for absolute risk reduction versus relative risk reduction. And that's another huge, first of all, it's a video that I also published on here, looking at absolute risk reduction versus relative risk reduction. And it's a huge chapter in the book. The author's own conclusions found that when you examine the 4S trial results, people on simvastatin for 5.8 years actually added 27 days to their lifespan. Simvastatin also demonstrated a reduction in all-cause mortality and a very impressive greater than 6% absolute risk reduction. This is not the most potent statin either, but the authors never bothered to evaluate this data or include it. The starting dose of simvastatin in the 4S trial was 20 milligrams, but could be changed to 10 or 40 as the trial went on by the physicians and investigators. The 4S trial dramatically reduced events in familial hypercholesterolemia patients who had atherosclerosis. This was an incredible history-making trial. So this was the first time ever that we actually saw something reduce event rates and death rates in people with familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a severe genetic disorder with very, very high cholesterol levels. Even these smaller absolute risk reductions, based on these earlier trials, we knew the effectiveness of statins long before we had more potent statins. Even these smaller absolute risk reductions carried out on a long enough time horizon would increase and the area under the curve extensively. See the previous discussion on absolute risk and the area under the curve. The authors also explained that this is the survival gain only during the trial time. For example, if you are in a trial for only 2 years and you increase your lifespan by 2 months, all we can conclude is that being on that medication for 2 years increases your lifespan by 2 months. We cannot extrapolate that any further. For example, the Jupiter trial was supposed to run for 5 years, but was stopped early due to tremendous benefit and ran only 1.9 years. They concluded that this means that being on Crestor 20 milligrams for 1.9 years added an additional 7.25 days to your lifespan, assuming you stop taking it after those 1.9 years. So if you take Crestor for, let's say, 2 years and stop, you're probably only going to add 7 days to your life. This is like, the equivalent of like, if I exercise for a month out of my life, how much time realistically is that going to add to your lifespan or health span? close to zero, like 1 or 2 days, a couple hours maybe. So this is kind of absurd. Like if you have an LDL cholesterol of, let's say 150, you take rosuvastatin for a year, drop it to like 70 or 80 for a year, and then get off the medicine and go back to 150 or whatever it was, you still have lifelong exposure to super high LDL cholesterol levels. This is like a smoker who quits smoking for 2 months and wonders how much more lifespan that's going to add to their life. Like if you're a chronic smoker, you smoke a pack a day, but for a year, you quit smoking and then jump back on. Do you really think quitting smoking, the intervention, is going to add decades to your life? No, it might add a couple days, might add a week, but it's absurd to think that that's going to improve or prolong your lifespan. Similarly with these statin trials. In this instance, being on rosuvastatin 20 milligrams daily for 1.9 years will add 7.25 days of lifespan to your life. That is all we can conclude. This ignores and assumes no compounding or cumulative effects. Just that 2-year intervention alone adds 7 days to your life. Again, the effects of statins are cumulative, and the area under the curve will continue to expand for the longer period of time that you are actually on the medication. The authors also stated in their own discussion, quote, there are a few studies with long-term follow-up after cardiovascular intervention trials showing that the survival might be substantial. So again, even the authors themselves said, like, if we actually put people on these medications and let them ride it out for decades, the survival would be substantial, especially when you look at those Kaplan-Meier curves where, like, not on medicine, they died this much. On medicine, we plummeted over decades and years and time. In Mendelian randomization studies, a 1 standard deviation increase in LDL cholesterol is associated with a 1.2-year shorter lifespan in those with known atherosclerosis. So if you are 1 standard deviation above the norm, you're going to live 1 year less. Now imagine you're like 2 years higher, 2 standard deviations higher, more and more. It's cumulative. It's not that it would be 1.2 years times 2. It may be 3, then 8, then 20, then what have you. We also have 20-year data on the WASCOPS, this is the West of Scotland trial that has been published. Statin treatment for only 5 years was associated with a longevity benefit with improved survival and a substantial reduction in cardiovascular disease outcomes over a 20-year period long after the medication was stopped. So these are people that were put on a statin. It was pravastatin, I believe, in this one. And they were on it for 5 years, and then it was stopped. And then we checked in on them 20 years later. Huge, substantial survival benefit. The 20-year WASCOPS data was for men who were on pravastatin for 4.9 years, basically 5 years, but not taking it in the last 10 years. So they took pravastatin, which is a weaker statin, for about 5 years and did not take it again. After 20 years, there was a 13% reduction in all-cause mortality, 21% reduction in cardiovascular mortality, and an 18 to 24% reduction in hospitalization rates due to any coronary event or myocardial infarction, respectively. The authors also noted that when you looked at the Kaplan-Meier survival curves in the 4S trial and calculated the area under the curve, you actually had a postponement of any cardiovascular endpoint of at least 100 days. Imagine just taking a medicine for 5 years and delaying a heart attack, stroke, death by 3 to 4 months. Now imagine if you stayed on that medication and kept your LDL cholesterol and ApoB low for decades. What do you think the outcomes were? So even just being on it for 5 years, the Kaplan-Meier curve separated quite early and added at least 3-4 months to your lifespan. Now imagine we multiply that by decades. It's a cumulative effect. It's not that the next 10 years would add another 3 to 4 months, the next 10 years would add another 3 to 4 months. It's cumulative. And the earlier you start, we know this from other data sets and other studies, the sooner you start keeping your LDL and ApoB low, the longer and the more compounding the effect. They asked, there was a study once done, and I have it in the book as well. If we were to lower somebody's cholesterol for only 30 years, would you want it to be the 30 years from age 20 to 50 or from age 50 to 80? Without question, we want it lower from 20 to 50. We should not be waiting till somebody's 50 years old or 40, most of the guidelines wait till they're 40 and say, hey, by the way, your LDL's high, let's put you on some medicine, because they've already started the destructive process inside their arteries at that point in time. We do not want to wait and let that accumulate and get worse. We want to start them right away at age 20, 25, whatever it might be, with lifestyle interventions and other ways of lowering your LDL cholesterol. And if that doesn't work, then obviously you need to be on medications so that the next 30, 40, 50, 100 years will be disease-free, and the cumulative effect starts to add up and compound so that you have a much, much longer lifespan and, more importantly, health span. The authors also noted, let's see, next. Further, they stated that there is inherent selection bias since they could only include 11 trials. The authors' final thoughts, and this is a direct quote from the authors. We believe that statins should be prescribed according to the prevailing guidelines. Statins are usually inexpensive and safe, at least in a clinical trial setting, and the benefit in terms of mortality or non-fatal cardiovascular outcomes cannot reasonably be challenged. Now, the rest of that chapter is quite long, but one of the things that people talk about or argue about, well, the reason we live, 50 years longer, obviously in the 1850s, 1900, and I'll put the graphics up here, people lived to about age 40, 45, maybe. By 1920 and 30, we started seeing that start to go up due to some of the things we mentioned. Cleaner water, sewage, no more wars, better medications, antibiotics, all that kind of stuff, right? Better technology. So, for example, nowadays, the people, 94% of people used to die of a heart attack and heart disease in the early 1900s. Now that number is like maybe 34%, somewhere in that range. And that data set and those studies are in the book as well. But generally, we have an almost 90% reduction in death from heart attacks. Although heart disease is still the number one killer, it has been going down and cancer is about to surpass it. Cancer is going up. More people are living with cancer because of better treatments. So more people in the future will likely die from cancer and other diseases, infections, other things, rather than heart disease because we're getting so good at treating it. So the next section of that chapter kind of goes over the graphics of in 1900, people only lived to about age 40, let's say. And as time goes on, better therapeutics, better cleanliness, better hygiene, better medications, therapeutics, that has expanded and improved and gotten better. The next thing that these people try to argue is, well, that's just because of infant mortality rates. Well, that's not true. When you include infant mortality rates, even a 15-year-old, which is long past being an infant, even a 15-year-old actually had a short lifespan too. They only made it to about 35 to 45, whereas today, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, they can easily live to 65, and nowadays, even close to 90. So the average lifespans in America and, the modern world have gone anywhere from the ages of 35 to 45 in the early 1900s, late 1850s, all the way up into, 86 for women now, 78 for men. And with a worsening burden of chronic disease, we are more overweight. There's more diabetes, more hypertension, more everything, despite lower, people are definitely smoking less. It's been pretty steady though for the last 50 years. Smoking rates have been about the same. Between 17 to 19% of the population smokes. But the burden of chronic disease has gone up, especially obesity, which is very pro-inflammatory. The number one thing that causes inflammation is obesity, adiposity. Having extra adipose tissue or fat tissue is what causes obesity. It causes inflammation, or one of the main causes. And despite that, we are seeing improved outcomes and less death from heart disease and prolonged lifespans, which is the most important factor. People are living longer with these diseases, which is huge. And, I think it's important to debunk some of this nonsense because it's super easy to fall for this stuff. Like, well, this guy seems, like a medical doctor. This guy seems accurate. He knows what he's talking about. Look at this study. Look at that study. He's a cardiologist. Look what he's saying. He's saying it only adds 4 days. Statins only add 4 days, which is totally a bunch of nonsense. I have no idea how these people can say this with a straight face. Either they just don't know. They're just really, really dumb and are very nonsensical, don't know how to analyze things, have a low IQ, or they're trying to sell you some nonsense, try to sell you some contrarian books and this whole thing of, don't take statins and whatever. But I think a lot of it is just they're stuck in the 1970s and 80s, data and science, and they just haven't upgraded. And it's time to upgrade. And there's no better way. And that chapter is much longer. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it's a much longer chapter because, I'd bore you to death and this video is already pretty long. But there's no better way to get to up to date than by downloading or, not downloading, but purchasing Cholesterol Truths. Most of the studies in here from 2023 and 2024, obviously there's some landmark trials, that are older, but the vast majority of the data is super up to date. Super awesome. I think you guys are going to love it. If you love stuff like this, join my community, drallo.net/community. You can talk to me every day. Download the Dr. Allo app. If you download the Dr. Allo app, you will have access to all of my masterclasses: cholesterol, pregnancy, EKGs, cardiac emergencies, emergency EKGs, hypertension, diabetes. More and more topics are being added every day, but you get them all free for now in the app. Eventually, they will obviously cost money, but right now they are free. Download the Dr. Allo app anywhere, that you can search for apps on your phone, what have you. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next episode.